The weekend he suggested the cabin, I thought it was the most romantic thing he'd ever done. We'd been married 3 years by then. Long enough that surprise getaways had stopped being a thing. Long enough that date night meant takeout on the couch and whatever was new on streaming. So when he came home on a Thursday with this look on his face, excited, almost nervous, and said he'd booked us a place up near Harper's Ferry for the weekend, I actually teared up a little. I'm embarrassed to admit that now. I told my coworker about it the next morning. She said, "That's so sweet," and I agreed. I genuinely agreed. I should back up. His name is Curtis. We met when I was 26 at a work happy hour. He was a friend of someone's boyfriend, one of those people you end up talking to at the edge of the group because you both reach for the same drink at the same time, and then it would be weird not to say something. He was funny. Charming in that low-key way where it takes you a while to realize how charming he's actually being. He asked me questions and then actually listened to the answers, which sounds like a low bar, but you'd be surprised. We dated for 2 years. He met my mom. She liked him. That mattered to me more than I admitted. We got married on the Saturday in October. It rained in the morning and cleared up by noon, and I remember thinking that was a good sign. For a while, things were fine. More than fine. We bought a house. We got a dog, a basset hound we named Crumble because he looked like he was falling apart at the seams. We talked about kids in that vague, someday way that felt comfortable and not urgent. I'm not sure exactly when things started to shift. That's the part that still bothers me most. Not what happened, but how long I didn't see it. It started small. He was quieter, more distracted. He'd be on his phone in another room, and when I came in, he'd set it face down on the table, which he'd never done before. I told myself he was stressed about work. His company had been going through layoffs, and he'd been passed over for a promotion he really wanted. I gave him space. I cooked more. I tried to be easier to be around. He opened a new bank account. I found out by accident. A statement came in the mail, his name only, at a bank we didn't use together. When I asked about it, he said it was for a fantasy football pool, something the guys at work had set up. Easier to keep it separate. It sounded plausible. I let it go. Looking back, I was doing what a lot of women do. I was explaining things away because the alternative was a thought I wasn't ready to have. Then about 4 months before the cabin trip, I found the search history. He'd forgotten to close out the browser on the laptop we shared. I wasn't snooping. I was looking for a pasta recipe I'd saved, and I went to the search bar, and there it was. A series of searches over about 2 weeks. Things like life insurance payout accidental death, and how long does it take to process a claim, and does cause of death affect beneficiary payout? I stood there for a long time. I told myself there could be an explanation. Maybe he'd been doing research for something at work. Maybe a friend had asked him. Maybe, and I actually thought this, maybe he was worried something would happen to me and was trying to be prepared. I closed the laptop, I made dinner, I didn't say anything, but I started paying attention differently after that. I noticed he'd increased my life insurance policy 6 months earlier. He'd mentioned it at the time, said our coverage was too low for the house, and I'd signed the paperwork without really reading it. When I dug it out and looked at the numbers, the payout in the event of accidental death was $420,000. He was the sole beneficiary. I'd assumed we'd named each other. I hadn't actually checked. I noticed he'd been asking more questions about my health. Not in a concerned way. More like he was cataloging. "How's your stomach been? Do you still get those migraines? You should really see a doctor about that thing with your wrist." Establishing a record, I thought. Building a narrative. I noticed he'd started doing more of the cooking. I want to be careful about how I describe what happened next, because I know how it sounds. I know it sounds like paranoia. I had moments of thinking that myself. Sitting at my desk at work, thinking through the list of things I'd noticed, and wondering if I was constructing something out of nothing, the way a person can do when a marriage goes cold and there's nothing concrete to point to. But I didn't throw the list away. I kept it in a notes app on my phone, locked behind a separate password, and I talked to exactly one person, my friend Rosie, who I've known since college and who I trusted more than anyone. I drove to her apartment one evening, told my husband I was going to the grocery store, and sat at her kitchen table and told her everything. She didn't tell me I was being paranoid. She said, "What do you need?" I told her I needed someone to know. In case something happened to me, I needed someone to know what I'd found and where I kept the records. She wrote it all down. She took photos of the notes on my phone. She made me promise to be careful. That was 6 weeks before the cabin. The weekend itself was a Friday to Sunday. Curtis handled all the booking. He showed me photos of the place, a small A-frame about 90 minutes from home, no neighbors nearby, right on the edge of a state forest. He said it would be nice to disconnect. I agreed. I didn't let on that the remoteness was the detail that had made my stomach drop. I packed a bag. I put my phone on the charger, and just before we left, while he was loading the car, I slipped a second phone into my bag, a cheap prepaid I'd bought with cash at a gas station 2 weeks earlier, just charged enough to make a call. I tucked it into the inside pocket of a jacket I wasn't planning to wear until we got there. I didn't tell Rosie I was doing that. I didn't want her to talk me out of it. The drive up was almost normal. He was in a good mood. He had a playlist going, music we'd listened to when we were first dating. He reached over and held my hand for a few miles. I let him. The cabin was actually beautiful. That's the part I wasn't expecting. I think I'd imagined somewhere grim, which was its own kind of projection. But it was warm inside, wood floors, a fireplace already stacked with logs. There was a small kitchen and a porch looking out into the trees. If I had been a different version of myself, a version without a locked notes app on her phone, I might have cried again. He cooked dinner. He'd brought groceries from home, said he wanted to make the pasta dish I loved, the one with the brown butter and the crispy sage. I watched him cook. I watched his hands the whole time. I ate very little. I moved food around my plate and cut things into small pieces, and when he wasn't looking, I slid some of it to the edge and left it. I told him it was delicious. He seemed pleased. About an hour after dinner, I started to feel off. Not dramatically. Not like the movies. Just a low nausea settling in, and a strange feeling behind my eyes, and my hands seemed to be slightly disconnected from my instructions to them. I sat on the couch and tried to read it clearly. Was it the food? Was it anxiety? I'd been running on anxiety for 6 weeks. It could have been either. I excused myself to use the bathroom. I sat on the edge of the tub and pressed my hands flat on my knees and breathed. This is real, I told myself. Something is happening. I got the prepaid phone out of my jacket pocket. My fingers weren't working right, and it took me 3 tries to get it unlocked. I texted Rosie the name of the cabin, the address I'd looked up before we left, and 2 words, "Something's wrong." Then I went back out. He was sitting at the kitchen table with his own phone, and the look on his face when he heard me come back. I've thought about it 100 times since. He adjusted too quickly. The expression shifted half a second too slow to be natural. Something was running behind his eyes. He asked if I was okay. I said I wasn't feeling great. Probably just tired from the drive. He said I should lie down. He'd clean up. I lay on the bed in the back room and stared at the ceiling. My heart was doing something strange. Not racing exactly, more like stumbling, losing its rhythm and finding it again. I focused on my breathing. I counted seconds. I thought about Rosie getting my text, seeing the address, knowing what it meant. Around midnight, he came to bed. He lay very still. I lay very still. I'm not sure either of us slept. In the morning, I felt worse. My hands had a faint tremor. When I went to make coffee, I had to concentrate on holding the pot. He watched me from the doorway and said I looked pale. He was worried. Maybe we should head home early, get me to a doctor. I said yes. I said I thought that was a good idea. He drove. I sat in the passenger seat and watched the forest move past the window. We'd been on the road about 20 minutes when his phone lit up on the center console. A text. He glanced at it. Something changed in the set of his jaw. He turned off the main road. I said, "Where are we going?" He said a shortcut. He'd looked it up. I knew the roads out there. I'd been up to this part of the state with my dad when I was a kid. There was no shortcut. What he'd turned onto was a forestry access road, unpaved, narrow, trees pressing in close on both sides. I said his name. He didn't answer. I said, "Curtis, where are we going?" He stopped the car. The engine idled. He sat for a moment with his hands on the wheel, and then he turned to me with this look that I will not try too hard to describe because I don't want to give it more power than it already has. It was the look of someone who has decided something. He told me he was sorry. He said things had gotten complicated. He said he needed to not be in this anymore. I asked him what he put in my food. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said he hadn't put anything in my food. I don't know if I believe that. I still don't know. What I'd felt could have been the anxiety finally cresting, 6 weeks of waiting compressed into a single night. Or it could have been something early stage, something meant to disorient, something that would have been harder to trace. What I know is that he got out of the car. He came around to my side and opened the door. He told me to get out. I had my regular phone in my jacket. I had the prepaid in my bag on the back seat. I got out of the car and then I turned around and reached back in for my bag, and he grabbed my arm. I said, I already texted someone the address. They know where I am. They know who I'm with. He went very still. I said it again. I said Rosie has everything. I said she has the insurance documents. She has the screenshots. She has the search history. I said the moment I don't text her back by 10 a.m., she's calling the police. It was 9:47. He let go of my arm. I got my bag. I walked about 20 feet away and stood with my back against a tree and called Rosie from the prepaid. She answered on the first ring. She was already in her car. She'd been in her car since 6 a.m. She stayed on the phone with me while she drove. She called 911 on her other phone. I stayed by that tree and listened to the birds and watched Curtis, who had not moved from the side of the car. He just stood there. I watched him make a decision about what to do and then not be able to make it. It took about 35 minutes for the sheriff's deputy to arrive. There were a lot of hours after that. A lot of questions I answered in a bright room with bad coffee. A lot of paperwork. My mom drove up as soon as I called her and sat next to me and held my hand without asking me to explain anything. What the investigation found, and this was the part that I hadn't let myself fully imagine, was that Curtis had been planning this since before the life insurance change. There were messages on the private phone he'd been carrying. There was a conversation with someone I didn't know about the cabin, about timing, about how to frame an accident in a remote location. There was a search, 3 days before the trip, for how certain medications interact with cardiac function and whether a small dose would show in a standard toxicology panel. Whether he actually administered anything that night is something that couldn't be definitively proven. The DA explained it to me carefully, but the intent was not in question. He was arrested. He is currently awaiting trial. The house sold in March. Crumble is with me. He's asleep on my feet right now as I'm writing this, making small, satisfied sounds that I find very comforting. I think about the version of me who cried when he came home with news of that trip. I think about her standing at the kitchen counter, genuinely moved, genuinely believing in the gesture. I don't want to be too hard on her. She was paying attention. She just hadn't yet learned what she was looking for. She learned. I want to say one more thing, because I've had a lot of people ask me, after they hear pieces of this story, why I didn't confront him sooner, why I didn't leave. Why I collected evidence quietly instead of going straight to someone official the moment I found those searches. The answer is that I wasn't sure. I was living inside the uncertainty of it, and the uncertainty felt like it required proof before it could be anything else. And I also knew, the way women often know without being able to explain it, that accusing without proof would not have made me safer. It might have made me less safe. What made me safer was Rosie, and the $40 phone I bought with cash at a gas station off Route 9, and the fact that when I finally said out loud, I think something is very wrong, the person I said it to believed me without needing me to convince her. That's what I'd want anyone to take from this. If they take anything, when the feeling is there, it is data. It doesn't have to be neat or provable yet. Write it down. Tell someone you trust. Be quieter than the fear. And maybe keep a backup phone. I've spent a lot of time since then thinking about what actually saved me, and the honest answer isn't dramatic. It wasn't instinct. It wasn't luck. It was a series of small, deliberate choices made by a version of me who was scared out of her mind but kept moving anyway. When I found those searches on the laptop, I had a choice. I could close the browser and decide I'd misread the situation, that the kind, funny man I'd married couldn't possibly mean what those words suggested. A lot of people make that choice. I understand why. The alternative requires you to hold two completely incompatible truths at once, that someone loved you, and that they are capable of this. That's not a thing the human mind accepts easily. But I didn't close the browser and walk away. I sat with the discomfort of knowing something I couldn't yet prove, and I let it change how I moved through my own life. Quietly, carefully, without tipping my hand. That's what I'd call intelligence. Looking back, not book intelligence. Looking back, not the intelligence, not the kind that shows up on a test. The kind that says, what I feel right now is information, and information requires a response. I didn't have proof, I had pattern recognition, and I chose to respect it. The preparation I did, the prepaid phone, the conversation with Rosie, the documents she photographed, none of that came from certainty. It came from discipline, from making myself do the unglamorous, slightly paranoid feeling thing on the off chance that I was right. Most people don't prepare for the worst, because preparing for the worst means admitting you believe it might come. I made myself admit it. That admission, uncomfortable as it was, is what kept me standing by that tree long enough for Rosie to arrive. And Rosie, I want to say something about her, because I think the version of this story people remember is the one where I outsmarted Curtis. But the truer version is the one where Rosie was already in her car at 6 a.m, where she had stayed up through the night watching her phone because I'd texted her 2 words and she had decided that was enough to act on. She didn't wait for more evidence. She didn't tell herself she was probably overreacting. She just moved. That's what real loyalty looks like. Not the kind you declare, the kind you demonstrate at 6 a.m. on a Saturday when nobody's watching. What happened to Curtis is a consequence of a pattern he built over years. The private account, the insurance policy, the searches, the messages on the phone they found. Each of those things was a choice, and choices accumulate. They compound. The life he was building in secret didn't collapse because of one mistake. It collapsed under the weight of everything he'd constructed. That's not poetic justice. That's just how actions work over time. What you build quietly is still something you built. I think about the person I was at the beginning of this. The one who cried when her husband surprised her with a trip. I don't think she was naive. I think she was trusting, which is different. Trust isn't a flaw. It becomes a flaw only when you keep extending it past the point where the evidence has shifted. She learned to read the evidence. And that, more than anything, is what I'd want someone else to take from this if they're sitting somewhere right now with a feeling they can't explain and a list of small things that don't quite add up. The feeling is data. The list is real. Write it down. Tell Rosie, whoever your Rosie is, and keep a phone she doesn't know about.